Well, good afternoon. Welcome to episode 3 of Coffee with Colette. My name is Colette Neese, and today my guest is Dr. Cassandra LeClair. Hello, Cassandra. How are you?
Hello, I'm good.
Uh, I'll, Dr. Cassandra LeClair is an author, professor, communication consultant, and motivational speaker. She's an expert on communicating feelings and improving connections. And Cassandra's mission is to educate individuals on how to have effective and healthy communication to enhance their relationships. She works to help others gain an understanding of their communication practices to improve their relationships with friends and family members in the workplace and beyond. She has a Master of Science in Communication Studies, as well as a Bachelor in Communication Studies and Psychology, and also has completed her PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she focused on interpersonal and family communication and specialized in women and gender studies. She teaches a variety of classes as a professor on the collegiate level, where she encourages her students to explore their own patterns and improve their own communication. Her teaching and research interests fuel her campus and community involvement, and from what I know is active in a lot of local organizations to seek to empower and educate individuals in relationships and identity. She lives here in New Braunfels, Texas, and has 2 children. She also has a published book out called Healing from Trauma and Reclaiming My Voice. And well as that, she just did an excellent TEDx talk about being open about trauma, crisis, and stress. And I will provide links to those below when this YouTube goes, when it's uploaded. So you'll have access to that already. And so we have been discussing, Cassandra and I'm going to call you Cassandra if that's all right, because she's a friend.
Yes.
We have been discussing doing a Zoom style interview for months now, and even before kind of the situations that are going on in our country right now with the global pandemic, with coronavirus, and then now we have nationwide protests. And I think it's just even more important and prevalent that we talk with an expert. I talk with experts such as yourself on communication in a time where it's so desperately needed. Is there anything about your introduction that I got wrong or that you'd like to add to?
No, it just is always so awkward to like sit and hear things said about yourself. So I was like, do I look at her? What do I do? So no, it was great.
Okay, good. Being that we are in a time that is, it's hard to even explain or put a kind of wrap our minds around. I mean, the global pandemic in and of itself, and the self-isolation and kind of loss of connection in some ways, physically and emotionally, to is one thing, and then it now with layered on top of kind of what's going on in our country right now with the death of so many, in the overt systemic racism that's in our daily news channel. I mean, it's always been there, but it's come to a crescendo. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, there's so much to talk about. That's what makes it hard, right? Because you start with, months now ago with the pandemic and the things that we're all trying to process and work through. And, even if you weren't personally affected in big ways, you were personally affected because your life shifted and the world around you shifted. And that's a lot for people to be aware of and process, on its own with the isolation, like what you were saying. And then you add to it everything that we're seeing more now, or more people are seeing. As you said, it's been there, it's been going on. Unfortunately, the systemic racism and the systemic just oppression in general that we have upheld for so long has been there. And now we're seeing the videos, we're hearing the stories, but it's not new, you know? And so you see more people who've, maybe it's because their emotions were already heightened from the pandemic. I've seen that argument, but honestly, is it? You know, it's like you see people who are so frustrated and angry right now, and it's like, how can you fault them for that when they've been living in this situation and living with these experiences their whole life? So it's just this crazy tumultuous time where we're all trying to figure out what is happening in our world, and there's a lot of anger, rightfully so, and there's a lot of sadness and loss. And I mean, how do you talk about that?
Yeah.
You know, how do you truly talk about it when, I mean, from multiple perspectives? Because like for me, I think about, you know, how I'm working through things on an individual level for myself, how I'm working through things on a level with my kids and trying to teach them things, you know, and then how do I get rid of that or keep that in check enough so that I can be a support system for somebody else, so that I'm not bringing my triggers or my own individualism into their situation and making it worse instead of being supportive. And like, it's a lot for me to think through and work through. And I have a PhD in communication, you know? So it's no wonder you go on social media or you have conversations with people and they go sideways real quick, or they devolve into like something that you didn't even expect or see coming, because everybody's like way up here right now from a multitude of things. And so any little trigger just, it makes it fall apart.
Yeah. You know, being that we're in Comal County and, you know, as you know, I'm running for office and for county commissioner, some of you don't know.
Woohoo!
And when you're in a city where the majority of people have a very entrenched, almost kind of community of, you know, kind of like you have to keep Comal County red, just this very tight bond, if you will, on some level. And mind you, that's shifting and changing because we're becoming in an urban environment where people are coming in from other places. People that have lived here are finally, you know, voicing their opinion. The reason why I bring this up is because historically there's been a lot of not only systemic trauma that exists when you have kind of this kind of cultural colliding of Latinx population and German population and silencing of voices. But when you don't hold the same shared beliefs of maybe some of the people in your community, it's met with kind of a overt people trying to kind of shut you up. And kind of this, when people have this cognitive dissonance against something different than what they believe, this kind of instinctual reaction of like, oh no, change. And yet the reason why I bring it up, I've said that, but is the position that I'm running for is supposed to be a nonpartisan position. It's supposed to be one that includes everyone, that it comes from the stance of it's not my party or no way. So in today's environment of such entrenched belief systems that it becomes people's identity, how do you have conversations with people to come together and say, look, you know, this is about all of us. This is about, and not saying that all conversations are about all of us. Like I can't speak for certain communities, but from a political standpoint, I'm asking, and social as well.
Yeah. I think it's so hard because there's a difference between solidarity in one's beliefs and finding people that you can relate to and still welcoming other opinions and still being open to have conversations. versus having solidarity and standing, like you use the example of keep Comal County red. Like you can have pride in that statement, or you can have, build the people that you want to work with toward that. But then I would hope that there would still be an awareness of other opinions. And I think that sometimes what we struggle with the most, and you can apply this across situations, it could be political, it can be social, it can be relationally. One of the biggest things is the awareness piece and the openness piece. Mm-hmm. And I think the one thing, I mean, this is what I tell my students over and over, because this is something that comes up for us all the time, because I have students who are in college who then go back home. Thanksgiving is the worst. They go home for Thanksgiving, and for the first time for many of them in months, they're sitting around a table with their families trying to have this happy, thankful meal, and it devolves into this terrible place because they're finally kind of maybe voicing their opinions a little bit more. They've gotten a little bit, into their own thoughts, and they come back from Thanksgiving and they're like, well, my family hates me now, thanks a lot, or whatever. And so my point being, kind of circling back, is that it's hard when we get to a place where we want to believe so strongly and we feel that we're right, that we're unable to have openness to see other people's ideas. Mm-hmm. And what I tell my students all the time is that me listening to you and really trying to understand where you're coming from and listening to your beliefs doesn't take away from my beliefs. If anything, it helps me become more solidified in what I do believe. And it helps me become more aware of ways I maybe need to research my opinion more, or think through things on a different level. So I think one step I would say is, like, if you can start to approach the conversations as a way to continue to educate and inform yourself. And I don't think we start that way. I think we start like because historically things have been bad. So we start with our guard up and we wait for somebody to say, oh, you're a Republican, or you're a Democrat, or you voted this way. And that's all it takes. And then we strike. Instead of like, okay, somebody comes at us with something, taking a moment and being like, all right, how do I really want to thoughtfully respond to this? And honestly, some people you can thoughtfully respond to death, as you know, on social media in particular, and you're never going to get that back. You're never going to get back that openness and that awareness and that understanding. And that's hard too, is because what that then does over time is it can close you down from being open. And then it becomes this cycle, right? And so the way we get out of these cycles and the way we get out of these things is by talking about it, is by acknowledging, like, look, we may be on opposite ends of the spectrum, but I'd like to explain to you where I'm coming from. And when somebody's explaining to you, you have to make the choice to be respectful and not interrupt and not interject. And then this is a big one, not sit there making a little checklist of all the
how you're going to respond
back. Yes. Because then you're just getting more defensive. I mean, you can feel it happening, right? Like, even as we're talking, you can see it. And so, like, there has to almost be some ground rules. And unfortunately, on social media, you don't get to establish those boundaries and those ground rules. I mean, it's a free for all, right? Yeah. So I would take that out of the equation. But like in person, it really is about like establishing that mutual respect and then not attacking the other person's choice. Like, if I'm sitting down with you and I can say, okay, Colette, I want to know why you believe, I truly want to know why you believe the things you do. Like, tell me why. Don't just say, oh, this person did that, or that person did that. No name calling, no attacking. Just let me hear you and why you believe what you do. And then you get to hear me. Mm-hmm. But okay, that sounds wonderful. How many times have you done that?
Yeah.
You have, but like, we don't give one another space to explore the opinions. We just let the opinions become entrenched in us, and we think that we can't grow through them or expand anymore, if that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, that's how I see it, like from a professional standpoint, at least.
And it's also learning how to listen.
Oh my God.
When I was at North Texas, I did my undergrad at North Texas, and we did this 1 week experiment where we went into the commons, and for like 3 hours, we had these shifts, this group mm-hmm. of people, club that I was in. And for 3 hours, we had to sit at this table, and we had a sign, and basically we could not talk. So all these people from the community could come in the commons, students or whatever, professors or people, staff or whoever, could come in and tell us anything. I mean, it didn't matter what it is. I mean, I got stories of how somebody was cheating on somebody, then to how somebody got a flat tire and how they had such a bummer of a day, to, I mean, it really varied, and you couldn't respond for 3 solid hours. And some of the conversations were 5 minutes and some were a long time. And it was kind of my first step years ago in learning how to quiet the mind, because it's really hard to focus when there is no back and forth, because there's only so long you can listen, before you really start, your mind wanders. But it was a really kind of intriguing experience to see when the conversation is just one way and your only job is to listen, and that it really is a skill. And I think as introverts, we may have a little of a leg up on listening comes more naturally. It doesn't mean that we can automatically quiet the mind, but we just, we do tend to listen more than we speak, or at least as an introvert, I do. However, sometimes we can lack in communication skills because of that, because for me, I can get stuck in my head, and I feel that I'm a much better writer than I am speaker, but not having that gift of gab or whatever.
Well, I'm sorry, side note, I'm really
ahead.
glad you did that experience. I had that experience because we have a listening unit in my interpersonal class, and we talk about that. And one of the things we always say about listening, and it's like so many communication practices too, is that since we start doing them at such a young age, we take for granted that everybody just does it and knows how. But there really are ways that you can learn and become more skilled at it, and truly, again, deepen your connections in your relationships. But it takes time. And how many people sit and have a class on listening? Not many. And most people, I always tell my students this too, I'm like, the majority of people, when you ask them, they will say that they are a good listener, when most of us actually suck at it. But we think we're so giving and listening, but we fail to take into account exactly what you're saying, all that mental noise that we have that's just there in the background, and how much are we really giving space to another person versus like keeping our space in our head for ourselves.
Correct.
So,
and as a chaplain, chaplains, a lot of times it's said that being a chaplain is a ministry of presence, and simply being there with someone. I specifically was a palliative care chaplain, and so being there through the death and the planning of that and the dying process is truly a really a master class, no pun intended, in listening, because what there's nothing that you can say more than simply being there and holding someone's hand. Someone, you're not talking theology with when a person has their last moments. It's the presence of being there, and kind of bringing that to one of the ways that we really worked on how to do that was trying not to go into your mind about what the other person is saying. Well, what does this have to do with me?
Yes.
You always want to make it about yourself. It's like to truly listen to someone and value their own experience and who they are separate from you, which I imagine if it's your family or somebody really close, it's difficult to kind of realize that it's not about you.
And that's hard because when we tend to personalize things, I mean, it is honestly one of the biggest problems in most people's relationships, and mine include, like, I had a horrible habit with it that I had to work really hard to break, and to constantly step back and be like, all right, is this really about me? Sometimes too, even when we think people are upset with us or what have you. And that's one of the problems when you're talking about more like controversial issues too, is if you're personalizing it, you're already typically starting out from a place of defensiveness then. So that's just not a great place to start any conversation, let alone one where there's going to be emotionally laden topics.
Yeah.
And so but that again takes a certain amount of awareness and an ability to like step back and be like, all right, what am I contributing to this right now? Like what, again, when we're triggered, it's not to say I'm not giving everybody a pass, like it's all my fault if I'm triggered. I'm not saying that at all. But I do think we're very quick when we feel that defensiveness to assume someone else is attacking us, when a lot of times they're really not. But then if we feel they're attacked, we're going to attack back. And that, like, again, and so it's hard. And again, like, it's not an initial response. Most of us do have that heightened, we want to kind of get in there sometimes. And so it's hard to just, especially with your loved ones, because typically the people who know you best also know how to hurt you a little bit too, right?
Right.
So sometimes those emotionally laden conversations, that's why they don't go anywhere, because once we're defensive, then it hinders our ability to see things clearly. Even if I love you and care for you and I want to hear you, if I'm defensive and taking things personally, I don't hear you, so yeah.
There's a neuroscientist out of California, Dr. Jonas Kaplan, I believe is his name, and he's doing all these studies on that. When you come across, when you hear a belief or you come across something or a person that challenges your own belief or something that's different than yours, that it lights up the ocular cortex of the brain. And then he said the response is like seeing a bear in the woods. And he said that it's an automatic fear response. And he said, and then also once you get past the fear, it can be like related to disgust, like seeing spoiled or smelling spoiled food. And you're like, if beliefs are that ingrained, and he talks about how, the shared beliefs, you usually surround yourselves in a community of people that have somewhat shared beliefs than you, even if they're not based in fact. I mean, they're not even when not based in fact. But it's the community in and of itself, and that it's an emotional connection, and that it's this. So like when you have something that the brain, when you have this idea and something's coming up against it, that the brain interprets these beliefs as part of yourself. Like even like if it's like protecting your hand or from touching something hot, the beliefs are so ingrained in who you are, that response is a protection mechanism that the brain wants to protect, because it's so changing belief
for sure.
is really difficult to do. And I think it's really, really interesting to hear how oral stories in situations are more likely to kind of shift people's understanding. And it brings in what you were saying about this kind of personal connection and trying to let kind of step back of, this is not about me. In really trying to see people on a, not trying to change someone's belief, but trying to figure out who they are, and are letting ourselves be known as well at the same time.
And I think some of that getting entrenched in our beliefs, and then like you said, it becomes a coping mechanism, right? At some point, like you say, the bear, like you feel the fear response, and so you develop ways to keep yourself feeling safe. But once you're out of a situation where you are safe, you don't need that coping mechanism anymore, right? But so often we hang on to those because we think that that's what's giving us the safe feeling. Right. And so how I translate that into communication then is like, you get used to that defensive feeling, and sometimes even if it's just for a moment, lashing out or clapping back or whatever you want to say feels good, right? Like you're like, okay, well, this is how I state, and I got that off my chest and I feel good. But most of the time it's not a lasting feeling for people either, that feeling of feeling good, because then again, you did that and that was your coping mechanism. But a lot of times then people will step back and be like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have said that, or I could have said that better. And so it's like really trying to sit with that discomfort that initial response that you have, that anxiety, whatever it is, and sit with it for even a second and be like, okay, what can I do with this differently? And that's hard. It's so hard, especially when you are passionate and you care about something so deeply. And I mean, I'm not here to tell you that I always get it right or I have all the answers. And this is something that, I have struggled a lot with in my relationships as well, because I don't align politically with a lot of friends who I value and care for and respect. And sometimes it's hard to see somebody as a whole person and see everything that they do for good, when maybe in one area you don't see where they're coming from at all, right? Because then that goes back to the cognitive dissonance, like you're saying. It's uncomfortable, and when we're uncomfortable, we want to get out of that, right? like sorry, no, I didn't see your text, whatever, right? like, abort, get out of here. And so like, then that causes so like what I'm saying, or where I'm going with that, is like, so I also understand why people shy away from conversations or don't share things on social media, or maybe don't use their voice. And then sometimes people will get mad, like, you don't speak out, you don't say things. It is a really uncomfortable space for a lot of people to even speak their mind. And especially if they are in a position where maybe they aren't quite sure, or they are trying to learn about things or grow a little bit. Like, I think they get to kind of figure that out without being scrutinized too. And right now, any opinion you put on social media is scrutinized. I could go out there and say the sky is blue, and somebody would tell me it's light blue, and like whatever. Like, and so I think that, unfortunately, as long as we have that space existing, it makes it harder for people to have in-person conversations, because maybe I want to talk to you about something and I'm like, okay, I'm going to tell Colette how I really feel about this. But then I woke up this morning and I looked on social media and I saw everybody like going back and forth about it. So all of a sudden, that confidence I felt like that I could talk to you, my good friend, about something, it's eroded a little bit, and I'm feeling a little more anxious. So that right there changes whatever I was going to take into my conversation with you, right? And so we can't separate it. It's all together. We cannot say that, oh, I'm not going to look at social media, or I'm not going to look at this, or and that's not going to affect my relationships. Because unless you're really isolating and not ever looking at any of it, it's affecting you.
Which in right now, with the stay at home and slowly integrating back, social media is a huge way that we've had connection. Other than school or CPE hours, I never used it. I mean, that was like, I didn't like call my family up on Zoom before, or like, so it's just this. Yeah, I want to circle back. There's on your page 71 in your book, it's really cool, y'all. She has these, for intro to her chapters, she has like quotes. I mean, I know the whole book is technically a quote, but you know what I mean. You can make connections anywhere with people who might have had nothing in common with you or your station in life. Be willing to be open and vulnerable. Show yourself. Share. Be present. Watch the world unfold. Your people are there. Stop expecting them to be exactly like you. You are unique. Find others who showcase their individuality and accept yours. And that was just extremely powerful for me. And you talked a little bit earlier about, voicing kind of your opinion or your beliefs, or kind of coming to others with things that you're thinking. And I think gender and sexuality, I think, also come into play. The roles that women are supposed to be silent in this kind of historical oppression, not to mention if you have the intersectionality of being a Black woman or a person of color, where you are socially in your financial standing, how much privilege you bring to the table. And there's all these layers. But as women, my mom, I was raised by a strong English Protestant woman, and I never knew that women couldn't be pastors until I was in college. Like, it never even crossed my mind. Like, that's how liberated in some sense she was, or the influence. And then I was like, whoa, there's people that don't think women should preach? What? And it was just like an eye-opening experience, because she had always said growing up, Colette, speak your mind. I'm not a mind reader. You know, she's very like, if you ask for what you want. And so I've always asked for what I want for the most part. And yet that is seen as being a troublemaker, or she's aggressive, or she's stirring things up, when I'm simply being direct, you know. And this kind of, so many women that I know, they're accused of being the angry Black woman or the angry Latinx, just because you're not having this like kind of shrinking violet kind of label that people want you to have as a woman in society.
It's
So
exhausting.
it's really fine lines sometimes that you have to walk, you know.
Yeah. It's exhausting so I'm teaching gender class right now. Again, it's one of my favorites to teach. It started today. And this is something that we talk about a lot, like everything you just said, because it's that extra layer of emotional labor of, rather than just being able to be myself, I have to protect your feelings. Yeah. And when I say that, so as a woman, a lot of times we are, you're supposed to be polite. You're not supposed to be direct, and if you're direct, you're bitchy or what have you. So it's like really important to me to make sure that we talk about the difference between being assertive and being aggressive. So, I mean, we gender children from a very young age, and we teach girls to like be polite and be ladylike. I mean, think about the things like that a lot of little girls in particular are told. And so then a lot of times that translates into people pleasing and into like, well, I don't want to say anything directly because I don't want to be offensive and I want to come across as polite. So I'm going to either beat around the bush, or I'm going to hedge, or I'm going to use all sorts of emojis in my text to make it to soften. We soften our messages. So the problem with that is, over time, that became ingrained in people's mind as the norm. So when you have somebody like yourself who will speak out directly and clearly, you're not being rude, you don't have a tone, you're not being defensive, you're being direct. But we ascribe all of these other adjectives to it when a woman is doing it. And it's so problematic.
And when people, I've had the experience, and I'm sure you had too, that once you get the label of being assertive or aggressive, it's hard to get rid of, because anything you say is going to be interpreted as like, I mean, even so I'll bring up politics, even the conversations with my family, like my mom is extremely conservative Republican. She's come to the left a little bit because of me, because of on issues on food and healthcare and things that she's learned about, just being because all of her children are Democrat. Just interesting.
That is interesting.
But we can come together on, so we can talk about things like food, the food system, and women's rights and things like that. But as soon as we begin to talk about something that I'm passionate about, she immediately feels that when I could be tiptoeing, in a way that she may not even perceive, because it's just I feel like you're ... as and it's like, dude, I have literally done everything to not
Well, and you have the history
family
there
history there too,
right? So there was probably one moment in time where you were meaning to be doing
not
that,
about,
and then that's what's ingrained. So then that's the response, right? Yeah,
it's not about being not about connection. It's about being right. Which is family. So
right. Well, and it's so hard too, because so often we keep, and especially in families, you keep people in a space where when you knew them during a time.
Mhm.
you know, or think about friendships, like, oh, I met this person then, and you keep them in that space without recognizing that the majority of us grow and change and shift a lot. And so again, it's back to that awareness and trying to really, who are you today, Colette? I'm going to see you for who you are right now.
Right.
And oh shit, that's really hard. Sorry, I'm swearing so much
That's
on
okay.
your, is this a terrible thing? I have a bad habit. But that's hard, again, to strip away, you know, anything that we've brought to the table before and just try to see you for who you are today. That's
Mhm.
hard to do, especially in families or where you have, I mean, a lengthy history with somebody. You know, we don't often sit with somebody for who they are in the moment. We bring all of that, you know, for good and for bad.
Mhm. So I, I'm going to ask you for some advice. So, for
Okay.
example, I'm going to give you an experience that I've had
Okay.
and then ask you about your perception. So, for example, so last year during the 4th of July parade, I was dressed up as Lady Liberty. There with my Emberlyn, who's my foster daughter. At the time, she was only about 7 months old,
Little. Mhm.
tiny, tiny. And she was in the parade. It was great because she's thinking everybody's, you know, because everybody's waving at her. She's like, yay. And we're walking with the Canal County Democrats. All, you know, there's not that many of us, at least in the parade. And, you know, Bob Rogers is dressed up as, you know, Uncle Sam, and he's real tall. And I'm like got the crown, you know, or, you know, it's 4th of July. It's a time of unity. And the things that people would yell. I am
Mhm.
with a child, for one. I mean, just from you're a baby killer to, I mean,
Mhm.
in a New Braunfels 4th of July parade, like I guess my eyes were opened. I mean, I've felt that tension a lot, and like it's never even crossed. I was just kind of like it's never, what do you do? Running for office is even another layer on it. What do you
Yeah.
do when you're confronted with kind of visceral hatred? Like it's never crossed their, I would assume it's never crossed their mind that there's actually pro-life Democrats out there. I mean, I'm not one, but I mean, I'm just saying in general, there are. And yet
Mhm.
the assumption, it's one thing to think something that's very unbecoming or kind of hate filled. It's another thing to publicly scream it out in the middle of a
Yeah.
parade. And so
Yeah.
you have, what do you suggest? Like, because I'm running for office, as I keep saying, um, and I really want people to know, or people to come together in a really truly bipartisan way to talk about, hey, what does it mean to have an open pit quarry on the our future of our drinking water over the aquifer? You know, what does it mean to not have a conservation budget? So in the next 20 to 25 years, when we're 250,000 people in New Braunfels proper, that we been overdeveloped so much that we can't go back and preserve species. What does it mean when we have an unhoused population that's growing? What does it mean when 1 in 5 kids are food insecure? You know, can we talk about these issues?
Yeah.
Even, I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, Green Party, Independent, Libertarian. These are issues we need to talk about.
Yeah.
And what do you, how do you suggest coming to the table? I'm just learning how I could be better at communicating
Yeah.
as a whole
No, I mean,
in a
it's
climate
hard.
that's so viscerally hateful at times.
It's
On both
hard.
sides.
I
I'm
mean,
not saying it's one or the other, you know.
no, I know it is both sides, and that's part of it. I have struggled with this, as you know. I again, I think it's very difficult because everything you're saying, it is typically people who are yelling those things are people who have closed off so completely and have put you in a box that there is nothing you could say or do that would change anything.
Right.
And that's, how do you go against that, right? Because you could, but you'd routinely be exhausted. And again, I mean, juxtaposing that with what is happening in our nation right now with the protests, like, yeah, you know, it's like, how many times are you going to stand up and have hate thrown at you before you snap? Right. And so, like, in that instance, in the parade, and I was at that parade, and yeah, what were you supposed to do? You were literally pushing your baby in a stroller down Main Street and people yell things. What are you supposed to do? You know, yell back in that moment? That's what I
I
would have
just smiled and waved. Happy
Yeah, smile and wave, you know, say things
Don't
in your
forget to
mind.
vote.
Yeah, bless your heart. Like, you know, but it's so hard. And so, like, I've been really working on trying to, instead of focusing on changing that person's mind, getting in a space then where how can I communicate more effectively to people who are open and who are listening, and how can I continue to grow those voices and grow my voice louder in those areas, because it is difficult to constantly give energy and attention to somebody who for many people might just want to get you riled up too, right? I mean, there's a whole subset of the population whose mission in life apparently is to get people to be triggered, right? And so it's hard, because it's hard not to get caught up in that. And I think it goes back to what, you know, listen to what you said. Everything that you said about why you're running and what's important to you, those are human issues. Those are not Democrat issues. Those are not Republican issues, libertarian. They're not any one group's issues. They're human rights issues. And those are things that we should all be concerned about. And so for me, and this again is like, people have to ask themselves what they're really believing. Because for me, if I look at a person, I look at you, and you're believing in those things, and you're talking about those and trying to make them better, it should be irrelevant to me whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican, because you are working toward the greater good for something for everyone.
Right.
But unfortunately, because again, they're so entrenched and ingrained, and we think we have to stand for something, we choose to stand for a party, or we choose to stand for, you know, this identity, without looking at the ways that that identity is inhibiting us, or kind of closing our mind, I guess, if that makes sense. And so that it's a hard space to navigate, because you want to give your attention and you want to try to change people's minds. But I think the best thing you can do with your energy, like honestly with your campaigning and everything, is to keep doing what you're doing. You know, you're reading with your daughter on social media, you're telling people over and over the things that are important to you. And you don't come at it as like, I am Colette and this is important to me as a Democrat, because it's not important to you as a Democrat. It's important to you as a person.
Yeah.
That's what I think people need to see. Stop giving the labels and start seeing people for who they are and what they're actually communicating. Because I don't need to know your label. I need to know your action and your words behind it and what you're doing with it.
Right.
I don't think I was helpful at all there, other than to
you
say
were.
I agree with you.
You know, it's been an interesting experience, because I've been speaking out on these issues for 20 years, if not more than that, with some of them. And some have been involved in, like, in front of the House or Senate for government relations on specific issues, or doing research on writing white papers, but I've never run for office. And so it's a different kind of microscope that people put you under, even people that are within your party or social group. It's a whole nother layer of scrutiny. I mean, I can handle it, but I mean, it's
right.
You know, it's
but I think
different. You know,
and politics are so hard for me to understand sometimes, in the sense that, like you just said, you know, like people in your party is like, that's what's hard, is I think it goes back to what you said, you know, like you feel solidarity with certain people in a group, even if you don't agree with them on everything, like you have the one thing that holds you together.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you're a Democrat or you're a Republican. Well, the problem with that is then it leads back to what we were saying, you know, putting people in groups and putting people in boxes. And like, I'm very quick to tell anybody, you know, when we get into these conversations, like, look, I don't agree with every Democrat either. And I've defriended as many of them as I have Republicans, if I'm being honest with you, because it goes back to that, like, what's the human level here versus having this label. And so you're experiencing it now from are you a good enough Democrat, or are you too Democrat that Republicans can't
Right.
get in touch with you or whatever, when in reality, what your mission is for the people of Comal County.
Right.
It's not for any one party at all.
And it's
for all of us.
And it's one of the beautiful things I think about local politics is the supposed separation from party in some sense, to be there for those people specifically in your community. That is diverse, by the way. I mean, we have close to 30% Latinx population. We have the Germans, we have Afro-Americans, we have people from, I mean, it's not as diverse as other cities, but to think it's just a German city is just not reality. It is an extremely white city in some ways, and a lot of, not to say that some Latinx don't identify as white, that gets tricky there, but I guess part of it is building trust. When you said to really have an open communication, you need mutual respect and building trust. And I think historically there has not been a lot of trust in Central Texas in and of with the Latinx population, and with women in New Braunfels, there's a kind of, it helps to have a German last name. I mean, there's tribalism that exists layer upon layer upon layer. And just building trust with other people on a one-on-one connection sometimes needs to be built. That's with some will take decades. I mean, you look at the current climate right now in our society, where we've had 400 plus years of systemic oppression and racism in over 6 years since the civil rights movement, and yet look where we are. I mean,
I know.
And I want to come to a close, because I really think that
I know.
people can really only intake so much information or a YouTube video.
I feel like we
all
could
right,
talk
I'm done
all day, though. I know, I didn't realize it's
so I would love
hour.
to invite you back in the future, and we could kind of talk some more if you'd be willing to do that, because I think that it's what you do, and your expertise is so needed in so many areas, in not only in my own life, but just in the world. And the kind of the inner work that we do is just as important as the work that we do in the world, and that it's this kind of cycle. And so what would you like to close on something, or is there something that you would like to say, or that you would like to respond to, or to leave people with?
I think my big things are openness and awareness. And so I think, like, right now more than ever, I've talked a lot about giving yourself grace and giving other people grace, but it's also just, being okay with the fact that you might not know how you're feeling and might not know how to talk about anything right now. And so if that's where you're at, the best thing you can do is admit that, and kind of get okay with telling your friends or your loved ones or your relational members, partners, hey, like, I don't have the words to articulate what I'm feeling right now, or I can't talk about certain things, or whatever it is. Like, I think starting there, with whether it be with a political conversation, whether it be with a pandemic talk, whether it be about the protests, if we start there in some difficult conversations with just like kind of being vulnerable and admitting, like, I don't know how to talk about this, but I want to, or I might want to, can we do this in a loving way? And it's when you start there, it does help people soften a little bit, because then it helps take that layer of defensiveness, and hopefully they can see you, and they can see, like, that you're trying to be open. So I guess that's my only piece of advice, is just keep trying. And if somebody shoots you down and they're not a safe person for you, then recognize they're not a safe person for you, and try to find a different safe person too, instead of going back to the same people over and over who make you feel that way. So,
and I mean, I truly believe that at our core, everyone, the one thing that kind of unites us all is that we all just want to be loved and valued for who we are. And that shared connection of vulnerability. Some people you just shouldn't be vulnerable with because you could get hurt. And I'm not talking
Yeah.
necessarily just emotional, but physical. I mean,
Yep.
So I want to tell you how much I appreciate you coming on Coffee with Colette. And I'm gonna watch this when I go into the editing, and I know that I'm gonna pick up, I should have brought that up, or
I know. I feel
so,
like we talked about so much. It was great.
so I just want to thank you, and I will leave the links to your, you have a website, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Your website, and then your Amazon link to your book, and then also a link to your TED Talk I'll leave, so
Awesome.
people can have access to that in the area. But thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.
I really
I'll talk to you
appreciate it.
soon.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If I can figure out how to turn this off.
I know. I sort of stopped my video.